On the first day Light Yagami picked up the notebook, the death god behind him made one quiet promise. When Light finally died, Ryuk himself would be the one to write his name. Light barely listened. Years later, bleeding on a cold staircase, that promise came due. Most people remember the ending of Death Note as simply the bad guy losing. The way he loses, though, and the empty place he ends up, is something most viewers never fully notice. Light spent the entire story certain he had become a god. This ending exists to prove, slowly and completely, that he was only ever a man. It does that through three things: the patient trap that beat him, the blank nothing that swallowed him, and the quiet world that moved on without him. Over this video, we walk through all of it: the warehouse, the forged notebook, the two different endings, and where Light truly goes when he dies. Welcome to Anabrain. Let's begin. Section 1. The man who was sure he had already won. Light Yagami walks into the last room of his life believing he cannot lose. That belief is the whole reason the ending lands the way it does, so it helps to understand where it came from and how deep it ran before everything fell apart. Years before this final meeting, Light was a top student, bored and quietly angry at a world he thought was full of rot. One day he picked up a black notebook that had fallen out of the sky. A death god named Ryuk had dropped it there because he was bored too and wanted to see what a human would do with it. The rule inside the notebook was simple and horrible. Write a person's name while picturing their face, and that person dies of a heart attack. Most people would have decided it was a sick prank and thrown it in the trash. Light tested it on a criminal, watched it work, felt the weight of what he was holding, and chose to keep it. What he decided to do with that power shaped everything that came after. He began killing criminals, and not a small handful. Over the months and years, he killed thousands of them, working through them like a man clearing weeds out of a garden. In his own head, he was making the world clean, taking out every bad person one by one until only good people were left standing. The world noticed. Criminals were dying everywhere with no cause anyone could explain, and people started whispering about a hidden killer who seemed to punish the guilty like some kind of higher power. They gave that killer a name: Kira. Light heard the name the public made for him, and he liked it more than he should have. For a long stretch of the story, one man came close to stopping him. A detective the world knew only by a single letter: L. Nobody knew L's face or his real name, which made him almost impossible to kill, since the notebook needs both a name and a face to work. The two of them spent the middle of the whole series circling each other, sometimes sitting in the same room, each one smiling and acting like a friend, while hunting for the chance to end the other. It was the sharpest battle of minds in the entire show. Light won it. L died, brought down by a plan Light built piece by piece. The day L died, something inside Light went quiet and still. The one person clever enough to catch him was gone, and the cold little fear that had been hiding under his confidence finally melted away. He stopped seeing himself as a smart student who had gotten lucky and gotten away with murder. He started seeing himself as the god of a new world. He said those exact words about himself, and the frightening part is that he meant every one of them. Then the story jumps ahead. Several years pass. Light keeps killing, keeps tightening his quiet grip on the world. And for a while, nothing and no one can lay a finger on him. But L had not left the world empty-handed. He left behind two young men who had been raised from childhood to take his place if he ever fell. One of them is calm and patient and likes to sit on the floor playing with toys while his mind works through a problem. His name is Near. The other is fast and furious and willing to break any rule at all if breaking it gets him the win. His name is Mellow. On their own, in their own separate ways, both of them decide to finish the case that killed the man who raised them. Everything in the end comes down to one building, a plain, ordinary storage warehouse called the Yellow Box. On the 28th of January, two groups agree to meet inside it, and both groups walk in fully expecting to leave as the winner. On one side stands Light, surrounded by the small team of police officers who have spent years chasing Kira, without ever knowing that Kira had been standing right next to them the whole time. Matsuda is there. Aizawa is there. These are men who trusted Light, who worked shoulder to shoulder with him, who refused to let themselves believe he could be the monster they were hunting. On the other side stands Near, backed by the small circle of people he trusts, the team he built for the single purpose of bringing Kira down. Two leaders, two plans they have each polished for years, one room to settle it in. Light is calm because he is holding what he is sure is a winning hand. He has a follower waiting in the dark, a man named Mikami, who worships Kira the way deeply religious people worship a god, and who has been carrying out Light's killings for him. Mikami spends his days quietly removing the criminals Light points him toward, and he believes with his entire heart that serving Kira is the highest and holiest thing a person can do. Light has set things up so that this man is hidden close to the warehouse, ready, with a notebook open, prepared to write down the name of every single person in that room except for Light himself. The plan, the way Light understands it, is smooth and certain. Nier will say something clever. The two of them will trade clever words back and forth. And then, while everyone is busy being impressed by how smart they all are, Mikami will write the names. And one after another, every person who stands against Light will drop to the floor dead. Light will stroll out of that warehouse as the only living soul left. Still trusted, still free, still hidden in plain sight. He has taken every step he can think of to protect the plan from every angle. He has turned it over in his mind 1,000 times and cannot find a single crack in it, mostly because he is certain that no crack exists. What makes the scene so tight and so strange is that Nier seems to already know about Mikami. Nier tells the whole room, plainly and out loud, that he expects a hidden helper of Kira to show up and try to kill everyone there. To almost anyone, that sounds like a warning. To Light, it sounds like a gift dropped right into his lap. He listens to Nier lay out the danger and decides the boy has marched straight into the trap without the faintest idea of what he has done. On the inside, Light is glowing with excitement. On the outside, he keeps his face calm and serious, but the show quietly lets the viewer feel the joy bubbling underneath, the smugness of a man watching his enemy dig his own grave with a smile. The sheer size of Light's confidence is the thing worth slowing down on. This is a person who has not truly lost in years. Every single time someone got close to the truth, he wriggled free. He beat the smartest detective who ever lived. He took the very police force hunting Kira and turned them into his own trusted co-workers. He gathered a flock of believers who would happily die for him without asking why. Year after year of winning had taught him something that felt like solid truth, but was actually the trap he never saw. He had learned that he always wins. And once a person learns to believe that about themselves all the way down, they stop checking for the small things. Because in their minds, small things do not bring down a god. A quiet sadness sits under all that certainty, even before anything goes wrong. The boy who picked up that notebook all those years ago was bright and full of promise. The kind of student a teacher points at and says, that one is going to do something great someday. Somewhere along the road, he traded every bit of that promise for the belief that he had the right to decide who deserved to live and who deserved to die. By the time he reaches this warehouse, he has stopped seeing the people around him as people at all. Matsuda is a tool. Mikami is a tool. Even the men who would weep at his funeral are nothing more than game pieces to be moved and used. He has climbed so far inside his own story that he has forgotten the simplest fact about himself, which is that he is still just a man, breathing the same dusty air as everyone else on that warehouse floor. That gap is the real heart of the ending, even though this first part only sets it up. The final stretch of Death Note is the story of a person who grew so sure he had become a god that he could no longer see the plain, ordinary human mistakes quietly piling up around him. Everything that comes next, every reveal and every death, grows straight out of the distance between how powerful Light feels and how human he actually is. He thinks he is standing high above the world, looking down on all of it. He is standing on a concrete floor in a storage building, and he's about to find that out the hard way. So the meeting begins, and the plan slides into motion. Somewhere close by, hidden away, Mikami opens his notebook and starts to write, certain that his hand is carrying out the will of his god. The names go down on the page. A count begins, the slow stretch of seconds that has to pass before a written name takes hold and the heart stops. Light waits for the room to start falling around him. 40 seconds, and then every person he came here to destroy should be lying dead at his feet. He counts the seconds in his head. He waits. And he lets a small smile creep onto his face. Because in his mind, these are the final seconds he will ever have to spend hiding. And the moment they end, he finally gets to rule the world out in the open. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What Light does not know, as he counts down toward a victory he is completely sure is coming, is that the notebook his entire plan rests on has already been handled by people who were never supposed to touch it. Days before this meeting, while Light was busy feeling like a god, a quiet man working for Nier sat alone in a dim room and did something slow, careful, and incredibly clever, with a pen and a stack of paper. The plan Light trusts more than he trusts anything in the world has already been flipped completely inside out, and the patient little trick that did it is where the real ending of Death Note actually begins. Section 2. The Notebook That Could Not Kill. To understand how a man who felt like a god lost everything in a single afternoon, the warehouse is the wrong place to look first. The real work that beat him happened days earlier, far away from that meeting, inside a bank, done slowly and silently by a man Light never thought about even once. Light had built his final plan around a clever shield, and the shield was a lie. He knew Nier's people were watching his follower Mikami day and night, so he handed Mikami a fake notebook to carry around in public, a copy with no power in it at all, nothing but paper made to look like the real thing. The idea was simple. If Nier's team tried to sneak in and change the pages of that notebook, they would be ruining something that was already worthless. Meanwhile, the real notebook, the one that actually stops hearts, stayed hidden and locked away where no one could reach it. He spread the killing around too, so the real notebook barely had to come out into the open. Takata, the famous television newsreader who spoke for Kira in front of the whole country and secretly served Light behind the scenes, was given real pages of her own and handled some of the killing herself. Between the public fake in Mikami's hands and Takata quietly working in the shadows, Light felt sure he had hidden the real weapon perfectly. In his own head, Light had built a kind of maze. Anyone hunting him would grab the fake notebook, change its pages, feel proud of how clever they had been, and walk right past the true weapons sitting in the dark. He believed he had blocked every path, sealed every door, and thought of every angle a person could possibly come at him from. He was certain of it, the way a person is certain the sun will rise. There was one small thing Light forgot to protect, and it had nothing to do with notebooks. His follower lived his entire life on a strict, unchanging schedule. Mikami did the same things on the same days, over and over, like a clock that never needs winding. He woke at the same time, he worked the same hours, and once a month, on the same date every single time, he went to the bank. One of Nier's people had spent a long time quietly studying that schedule. A careful, watchful young man named Gavani had been trailing Mikami for weeks, staying out of sight, writing down everything Mikami did and when he did it. Slowly, patiently, Gavani built up a full picture of the man's life. He knew Mikami's habits better than most of Mikami's neighbors did. He knew which day of the month Mikami visited the bank, and he had no idea yet why that visit mattered so much. He just knew it was a pattern, and patterns are worth watching. Then the pattern broke. Takata was suddenly taken, snatched away while Light and Mikami were not looking, and the loss of her threw Mikami into a panic. With his god's helper in danger, Mikami did something he had never done before. He rushed to the bank on the wrong day, off his schedule, breaking the steady rhythm he had kept for so long. He needed to reach the real notebook so he could write Takata's name and handle the crisis himself, the way a loyal servant believes he should. That one broken habit was the crack the whole plan poured through. Giovanni watched Mikami hurry to the bank on a day he was never supposed to go there, and to a patient watcher, that single wrong move screamed the truth. It told Nier two things at the very same moment. The first was that the notebook Mikami carried around in the open had to be the fake, because the real one was clearly somewhere else, somewhere important enough to send Mikami running on the wrong day. The second, and the larger one, was that the real notebook was almost certainly hidden inside that bank. What Giovanni did next was the quiet, careful work that ended Kira. He copied the card that unlocked Mikami's private box inside the bank. He let himself in. And there, sitting in the dark exactly where Light thought it was safe, was the real notebook, the true weapon the whole maze had been built to hide. Giovanni did not simply take it and run. He sat down and made a perfect copy of it by hand. Every name already written inside he copied. Every smudge, every crease, every worn corner of every page he matched. He worked at it until his fake looked exactly like the real notebook, close enough that even the man who owned it would never spot the difference. Then he made the swap. The powerless copy he left behind in the bank box for Mikami to find later. The real notebook he carried out with him and handed to Nier. From that moment on, the trap belonged to Nier, and Light had no idea. Mikami still believed his real notebook was sitting safely in the bank, waiting for him. He had no clue that the thing locked in that box was now a dead copy, a stack of fancy paper made by the very enemy he was trying to kill. When the day of the warehouse meeting arrived, Mikami collected that copy, fully certain he was holding the real instrument of his god, and carried it to the warehouse to wipe out everyone standing against Kira. The thing that makes this so cruel is the part of his plan Light was proudest of. His whole scheme stood on one belief, that his follower was perfectly reliable. And in a way, Mikami truly was. He never missed a killing. He never once questioned an order. He served like a machine that never breaks down. But that steady, perfect reliability was the exact thing that gave him away. A man who does everything the same way every day is the easiest man in the world to learn, to predict, and to copy. The devotion Light treasured most turned into the rope that hanged him. What finally brought the god down was something almost boring to describe. A man followed another man around for weeks. He wrote down his habits. He noticed when one of them suddenly changed. He copied a key card, walked into a bank, copied a notebook by hand, and waited. There were no grand speeches in that bank box, no flashes of impossible genius, no dramatic showdown. Just slow, patient, ordinary attention. The kind a person uses to solve a difficult puzzle one piece at a time. That plain, quiet effort was the whole trick that toppled a man who thought he had become a god. It points back to the gap that the entire ending is built around. Light spent years thinking like a god, gazing down at the world from somewhere high above everyone else, too far up to bother with little details. The people who caught him spent those same years doing the opposite, leaning in close, studying small things, a card, a date, the worn edge of a page. The story is quietly arguing about which way of looking at the world actually wins in the end, and the man who looked down lost to the men who looked closely. So that is the truth Light has no clue about as he stands on the warehouse floor, counting down his seconds to glory. The notebook his follower is using at that very moment is a corpse, a copy with no power to harm a single soul. The names being written on that page will not kill anyone. The 40 seconds Light is happily counting toward his crowning victory are really the final 40 seconds of his life as a free man, and he is spending them smiling. There is one last piece that turns the copy into a knife pointed at Light himself. Mikami, doing exactly what his beloved god asked of him, is carefully writing down the name of every single person in that room except for one. He is leaving Light out on purpose, sparing him, because Light gave that order long ago. Which means when the writing stops and that notebook is finally pulled into the light and read, it will hold a long list of names with one obvious, screaming gap in it. And the empty space where one name should be will point a finger straight at the only man who was spared. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The strangest part of the god's downfall is hidden inside all of it. The patient plan, the copied notebook, the swap in the bank, the perfect trap. None of it would have worked at all if Mikami had simply kept to his schedule like he always did. He only broke his routine because Takata was taken, and the person who took her was no part of Nier's careful plan. That person did not answer to Nier. He was not following any clever script. He was a wild, furious young man that L had also left behind in the world. And the reckless, desperate thing he did, almost by accident, is the true reason Kira ever fell at all. Section 3. The boy who refused to come second. When the great detective L died, the job of catching Kira did not die with him. He had quietly prepared for the day he might lose. Two young men had been raised almost their whole lives to step into his place if he ever fell. And after he was gone, both of them turned their eyes toward the same target. One of them would catch Light in the end. The other would die before he ever found out whether he had helped. Both of them grew up in the same place, a quiet home in England for gifted children who had no parents. The home took in unusually bright kids and trained the sharpest among them, raising them with one rare possibility in mind, that one day, one of them might become the next L. Of all the children there, two rose to the very top. One was named Nier, the other was named Mello. They knew each other for years, and they could not have been more different. Nier was calm to the point of seeming cold. He sat on the floor and played with toys while he worked through a problem, never raising his voice, never rushing. Mello ran hot. He moved fast, felt everything strongly, and hated to wait. The two of them were almost like two halves of the same person. The patience and the fire that had lived together inside L now split into two separate boys. And there was a ranking between them, a clear sense of who stood first and who stood second. Nier was first, Mello was second. That fact sat inside Mello like a splinter that never came out. So when the adults running the home suggested that the two of them join forces and chase Kira together as a team, Mello said no. He could not stomach the idea of being the junior partner in a plan that would always, deep down, belong to Nier. Working side by side would have meant accepting second place forever. Rather than do that, Mello walked away from the only home he had ever known. He told them he would find his own way to win, alone, and he left. The road he chose was a dark and dangerous one. Mello went and got himself tangled up with a gang of hardened criminals, the kind of people who hurt and kill without much thought. He got his hands on a copy of the killer notebook of his own, and he began doing things that Nier, with all his careful patience, never would have dreamed of doing. He kidnapped people. He made threats. He used fear and force as tools. At one point, he even kidnapped Light's own younger sister, holding her to squeeze what he wanted out of the police. Mello was willing to get his hands as dirty as the case demanded. For a long stretch, the two heirs raced toward the same man along completely separate paths. Both of them slowly circled in on Light. Nier worked from the careful, watchful side, building his case grain by grain. Mello pushed in from the rough, violent side, kicking down doors and forcing things to move. They almost never shared what they each learned. Whatever crossed between them crossed by accident, in stray pieces, never as real teamwork. Two hunters, one prey, no plan in common. Then came Mello's final, reckless throw of the dice. He had worked out the truth that Light was Kira, and he had also learned that Nier was finally getting ready to spring his own trap. Mello could feel the end game coming, and he refused to sit on the sidelines while Nier took the win. He decided to do one last drastic thing, something violent enough to either crack the whole case wide open or blow it to pieces. He set his sights on Takada. Takada was the famous television newsreader who had become the public voice of Kira, speaking for him on screens across the country. Behind the scenes, she was far more than a voice. Light trusted her with real pages of the killer notebook, and she quietly carried out some of the killing herself, keeping Light's machine humming while drawing attention away from his true follower. Pull her out of the picture by force, and you might just yank loose a thread that could unravel the whole hidden operation. The kidnapping was a wild, loud, dangerous thing. Mello brought along his oldest friend from the children's home, a young man named Matt. Matt hurled a smoke bomb at the line of cars carrying Takada, turning a calm public moment into chaos and panic in seconds. While everyone choked and scrambled in the smoke, Mello rode up on a motorcycle with his face hidden behind a helmet and offered to carry Takada away to safety. Frightened and unable to see clearly, she climbed on behind him. By the time she understood who was really driving, the motorcycle was already gone. But the plan tore apart at the edges almost at once. Takada's guards gave chase. Matt, who was supposed to slip away clean, got cornered, and the guards shot him down in a storm of gunfire. Mello had never meant for that to happen. His whole plan had counted on his friend getting out alive. He managed to lose the guards, lock Takada in the back of a delivery truck, and drive on. But the news of Matt's death reached him through a small television, and it hit him hard. He carried on sick with guilt over the friend he had just gotten killed. What ended Mello was a small act of mercy, of all things. He ordered Takada to take off her clothes, wanting to be certain she had no hidden machine on her that could be used to track them down. Then he handed her a blanket so she could cover herself. That blanket was his death. Tucked away in her clothing, Takada had hidden a small scrap torn from the killer notebook and something to write with. Under the cover of that blanket, where Mello could not see her hands, she carefully wrote down his name. She was only able to do it because she knew his true name, and a true name is the one thing everyone tied to that notebook guards above all else. Mello had kept his real name secret nearly his entire life, but Light had managed to dig it up sometime earlier, with the help of work his own father had quietly done before he died, and Light had handed that name to Takada ahead of time, saving it for a moment exactly like this one. The instant Takada finished writing, Mello's heart stopped. The truck slammed into a building. Just like that, the boy who refused to come second was dead. The cruelest part is the timing. Mello died without ever learning whether his desperate gamble had worked. He never saw the warehouse. He never watched Light get cornered. He never witnessed the god he had hunted finally come crashing down. He bet his life and his best friend's life on one violent roll of the dice. And then he died before the dice ever finished tumbling, never knowing how they would land. They landed in his favor, though he could not have planned the way it happened. Snatching Takada set off a chain of events that nobody, not even Mello, could have seen coming. With his trusted helper suddenly in danger, Light's follower Mikami panicked and rushed to the bank on the wrong day, breaking the strict clockwork routine he had kept for so long. That single broken habit, born straight out of Mello's chaos, is the exact slip that let Nier's watcher find where the real notebook was hidden and quietly copy it. The careful trap only worked because the reckless one shook the whole board. After everything was finished, Nier said something that flips the entire ending around. He admitted, plainly and without dressing it up, that his own careful plan would have failed completely without Mello. If things had simply gone the way Nier expected them to, Light would have won, because Nier would never have discovered that a real notebook was sitting in that bank at all. The wild, rule-breaking, dangerous thing Mello did is the only reason the patient, gentle plan ever had a path to victory. The thinker needed the wrecker. Step back, and the shape of it becomes clear. Light spent the whole series beating one brilliant mind at a time, and beating them cleanly. He outlasted L. Left alone in a fair one-on-one contest, he very likely would have outlasted Nier too. The thing Light could not handle was two sharp minds coming at him from two opposite directions at once, neither of them telling the other what they were doing. He had a plan for a single enemy. He had no plan for two. The strangest truth in the whole ending is that the people who caught Kira were never really a team. They were rivals who could barely stand to be in the same conversation. One was made entirely of patience, the other entirely of fire. Neither one could have brought Light down on his own, and the two of them never actually worked together for a single day. Light was destroyed by their refusal to cooperate, by two separate hands that happened to close around his throat at the very same moment, for completely different reasons. It all circles back to the belief Light built his life on. He thought of himself as one great mind standing far above everyone else. And inside a clean, fair, one-on-one game, he might have been right about that. The thing he never once planned for was messy, stubborn, ordinary human feeling. The kind of feeling that makes a proud young man risk everything rather than accept second place. Light could outthink any single person alive. He had no answer for the chaos of two people who would not stay in their lanes. There is something deeply sad and deeply human buried in Mello's part of all this. He did not lay down his life for justice in some clean, noble, heroic way. He did it out of pride, out of fresh grief over the friend he had just lost, and out of a stubborn refusal to be beaten by Nier one more time. His reasons were tangled, selfish in places, and completely human from start to finish. And those flawed, human, messy reasons are exactly what finally cracked open a man who had convinced himself he had climbed above being human at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Across the city, while Mello lies dead in a crashed truck, and the trap he never meant to set quietly snaps shut inside a quiet bank, Light is still standing on the warehouse floor. He is smiling. He is counting down the last of his 40 seconds, fully certain that any moment now, the room around him will fall silent and still, every enemy dead at his feet. He does not know that the count he trusts so completely is about to hand him the single worst moment of his entire life. Section 4. When nobody died. 40 seconds is not a long stretch of time. Standing in a doorway waiting for a kettle, it passes almost before it is noticed. Inside that warehouse, with Light Yagami counting it down in his head, those same 40 seconds stretched out long and thin and unbearable. He stood there waiting for the people around him to start dropping to the floor, one after another, until he alone was left standing. And then the seconds ran out. Nothing happened. The room stayed exactly as it was, full of people who were standing, breathing, blinking, alive. Nier went on quietly handling the small toy in his fingers. The police officers stayed on their feet. The members of Nier's team stayed on theirs. The full count came and went, and every single person Light had marked to die was still very much among the living. The smile that had been spreading across Light's face froze halfway, and then slowly came apart. His eyes flicked around the room and counted the seconds over again. Sure, he must have made a mistake. Certain the dying was only a heartbeat away. The dying never came. For the first time in years, something Light had planned down to the last detail had refused to happen, and he had no idea why. His follower fell apart even faster. Mikami, who had spent his whole life serving Kira like a holy mission, could not make sense of what he was seeing. His god's enemies were supposed to be corpses by now, and instead, they were staring back at him. In his rising panic, he blurted it out, half to himself and half to the whole room, that he had done everything he was told, that he had written down every name exactly as his god had commanded him to. And as the words spilled out, his eyes shot straight to Light. Every other set of eyes in that warehouse followed Mikami's gaze. A grown man had just cried out about a god he obeyed and names he had written on command, and the entire time he was staring directly at Light Yagami. In a single clumsy moment, the hidden thread connecting the man who did the killing to the man who gave the orders had been yanked tight, right out in the open, for everyone to see. Nier did not even raise his voice. Calm as still water, he gave a short, simple order to his two men, Rester and Giovanni, telling them to take hold of Mikami immediately. They closed in and seized him before he could do anything more, before he could write, before he could run. Then Nier laid out the truth in that quiet, flat way of his. The notebook Mikami had been so proudly filling with names was a fake, a careful copy made by Nier's own people, and swapped into place so smoothly that Mikami had never felt the difference. The genuine notebook was already sitting safely in Nier's possession. Every name Mikami had written in that powerless copy had done nothing at all. Not one of them had so much as raised a single heartbeat. What came next is the thing that ended Light for good. The fake notebook was picked up and read aloud, and there on its pages sat a neat list of names. Every person who had walked into that warehouse, each one written down to die. Every name but one. The single name missing from that whole list of the doomed was Light Yagami. A killer who carefully writes down every person in a room and leaves out exactly one name is not doing it by chance. He is shielding the one person he serves above all others. That empty gap where Light's name should have been worked just like a signed confession. It pointed at Light, and at Light alone, and there was no honest way to explain it away. One more thing pushed the door shut, and Light had done it to himself. Only moments before, certain he had already won, Light had not been able to hold his tongue. He had crowed about his victory out loud, right there in front of the whole room, before the trap had even been sprung, before the fake notebook had been revealed. He had let the whole warehouse hear how thrilled he was that everyone in it was about to die. A man who is being framed, who is truly innocent, does not stand in a room cheering for the murders of the people beside him a single breath before those murders are meant to take place. The officers who had worked shoulder to shoulder with Light for years had just heard him celebrate their deaths with joy. Once they had heard that, no clever words could ever pull it back. The sound of his own gloating hung in the air and damned him. Light tried anyway. He scrambled to recover, telling the room it was all a setup, all a trick, swearing he was being framed by his enemies. The words fell flat and dead. The police who had trusted him did not believe him. Nier did not believe him. The man who had been laughing in triumph seconds ago could not suddenly become the wounded innocent now. Not one person in that warehouse swallowed a single word of it. And then something inside Light finally gave way. The calm, kind, gifted young man everyone thought they had known peeled away and vanished, like a costume yanked off all at once. What stood underneath was Kira, fully exposed and done hiding. He stopped pretending to be anything other than what he was. He admitted all of it. He declared that he was Kira, that he had made himself into a god, that every death he had ever caused was justice, and the world owed him thanks. He laughed. He ranted. The whole long performance of the good son and the loyal teammate fell to the warehouse floor in front of every shocked face. For the men in that room, watching it was a sickening thing. They had shared meals with this person. They had trusted him with their safety and their work and their secrets. And now they stood and watched him cackle about godhood and brush off the murder of thousands as a gift to mankind. The young man they thought they understood was gone, and the thing wearing his face frightened them. The wound went deepest because of the man who was no longer alive to see it. Light's own father had once led this very team. He was an honest, brave, decent man who had believed in his son with his entire heart. And he had died still believing, never told the truth, used and lied to right up to his final breath by the boy he loved most. To the people who had loved and respected that father, watching Light unmask himself this way felt like watching him kill the old man all over again. Slower and crueler this time. Even cornered, even exposed, even raving, Light still had one last card tucked away. Hidden inside his wristwatch was a tiny secret compartment, and inside that was a small scrap torn from the killer notebook, saved for exactly this kind of dead end. If he could write down even one name on that scrap, he could still drag someone down into death along with him. He lunged for it, tearing the watch open, ready to scratch out Nier's name in his own blood. One person in that room had reached his breaking point. Matsuda was the youngest of the officers, the eager one, the one who had looked up to Light the longest and the hardest, the one who had wanted with all his heart to believe that the bright young man at his side could not possibly be the monster they had spent years hunting. Watching Light laugh about being a god, then watching him reach out to claim one more victim, snapped something in Matsuda all the way through. Matsuda raised his gun and fired. The first shot ripped the scrap and the pen straight out of Light's hand before he could finish even one letter. And Matsuda did not stop there. Shaking, shouting, years of trust and grief and fury pouring out of him all at once, he pulled the trigger again, and again, sending bullet after bullet into the man he had once been proud to call his friend. Light dropped. He folded down onto the cold concrete, bleeding from a handful of wounds, the god costume soaked through and coming apart at the seams. The same man who minutes earlier had been so utterly certain he would stroll out of this warehouse as the master of a brand new world was now slumped on the floor, gasping, broken, and completely out of tricks. Every plan had collapsed. Every follower was captured or dead. The room he had meant to pile high with bodies held only people watching him bleed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Every step that had carried Light to this point led straight to this one image. The unshakable certainty from the very first day, the trap quietly hidden inside his own trap. The two rivals closing in from opposite ends of the world. All of it ended here, with a wounded man on the ground who had finally and fully run out of road. The god was gone. Only the scared, hurting human remained. And in that exact moment, while Light lay too weak to stand and too broken to scheme, the one figure who had silently watched this entire story from its very first page stepped forward at last. The death god who had let that notebook fall into Light's life so many years ago was about to keep a promise he had made on the day the two of them first met. Section 5. The Promise. From the first day of everyone tangled up in this story, one watcher had been present from the very first moment, standing just behind Light the entire time, seeing every plan and every lie. He was not a human being at all. He was a death god named Ryuk, the creature who had set the whole thing in motion. And now, with Light bleeding and broken on the ground, it was finally his turn to do something. To understand why Ryuk matters so much at the end, the beginning is the place to look. Ryuk was bored. Life in the world of the death gods was a dull, gray, endless stretch of nothing happening, and he wanted something interesting to break the boredom. So he carried one of the killer notebooks to the edge of his world and dropped it down into the human one on purpose, just to see what some random person might do with that kind of power in their hands. He was not trying to save anyone or punish anyone. He only wanted a show worth watching. The human who picked it up was Light. On that very first day, long before any of the killing began, long before Light ever dreamed of calling himself a god, Ryuk floated into his room and told him a few plain, honest things. He told Light the notebook was real, and the deaths were real. He warned him that nobody who uses the notebook gets any kind of happy reward waiting for them on the other side of death. And then he made one quiet little promise that Light barely seemed to notice. On the day that Light finally died, Ryuk said, he himself would be the one to write Light's name down. That promise sat there at the start of everything like a small, buried seed, and Light strolled right past it. He was far too thrilled with his new power to take a single word of it seriously. In his head, the notebook was his, the power was his, and the strange, winged creature hovering behind him was a sort of sidekick, an odd helper who had handed him the keys to the entire world. He never once grasped the real truth of it, which was that he had the whole thing turned completely backward. All through the story, Ryuk made no secret of what he was. He reminded Light over and over that he was not on his side, that he was no friend and no partner, that he would not lift a single finger to rescue Light if everything fell apart. He was a watcher and nothing else, drifting along behind Light, munching on apples and soaking up the most fun he had enjoyed in longer than he could remember. When dropping a hint kept the show interesting, he dropped one. When silence was more interesting, he kept quiet and let Light wander straight toward danger. The only thing Ryuk was ever loyal to was his own entertainment. In a strange way, that made the death god the one honest voice in Light's whole life. Every human Light dealt with, he lied to, used, or fooled. The police trusted a mask. His followers bowed to a mask. His own family loved a mask. Ryuk was the single being who always handed Light the plain, cold truth about their deal. And Ryuk was the exact one Light chose not to listen to. The creature never once pretended to care about him, and Light, buried under all the lies he had built himself, could no longer tell the difference between the one who told him the truth and the many he was busy tricking. By the end, the show was nearly finished, and Ryuk could see it as clearly as anyone. Light lay slumped and bleeding on the warehouse floor, his plans in pieces, his followers gone or captured. Every clever trick burned up and spent. Hurt and abandoned, Light forced his body upright and tried to get away, dragging himself out of that warehouse and stumbling off into the dark, still clawing for any escape at all, the way a cornered animal keeps running even when every path is already closed. With nothing left and no living soul beside him, Light turned to the one figure that remained. He looked up at Ryuk, the death god, the source of all the power he had ever held, hoping against all hope that the creature might do something for him, might write down the names of the people hunting him, might hand over one last escape, the way the notebook had handed him everything before. Even in that final moment, Light still half believed the power was his, and that Ryuk somehow served his wishes. Ryuk gave him the truth instead, the very same truth he had offered on the first day, the one Light had been far too proud to keep. The death god was never going to save him. There was no reason left for the show to keep running. Light was done. Even if he somehow crawled off into the night, he would be tracked down and locked in a cage for the rest of his life. And watching a once brilliant man slowly rot behind bars struck Ryuk as the dullest possible way for the story to end. So the death god did exactly what he had told Light he would do on the day they met. He opened his own notebook, and he wrote down the name, Light Yagami. In that instant, Light finally understood. The power he had spent years certain was his own had never belonged to him for a single day. He had been borrowing it the whole time, holding a thing that was lent to him for someone else's amusement, and now the one who had lent it simply took it back. The death god Light had treated like a servant, had owned the entire game from the first page to the last. The notebook gives a person only a short stretch of time once their name is written, a little under a minute before the heart quietly gives out. Light spent that handful of final moments completely alone. No follower rushed to his side. No family member held his hand. The crowds who had once whispered his name like a prayer had no idea their god was dying in the dark on an empty flight of stairs. He had set out to rule the whole world, and at the very end, he had no one beside him at all. As the last of his strength drained out of him, Light's eyes settled on something across from him. Standing there, calm and still and quiet, was the one enemy who had come closest of all to stopping him. The detective the world had only known as L, the man Light had outmaneuvered and buried years before. Whether that figure was truly present or only an image his fading mind painted for itself, the meaning landed the same either way. Even in his final breaths, Light could not get away from the one person who had seen straight through him before anyone else. Then the time ran out. Light's heart, the very same kind of heart he had stopped in thousands of strangers with a single stroke of a pen, stopped beating beneath him. The self-proclaimed god of a new world died the exact death he had handed out so freely to people he never knew, alone, on a cold staircase, with a death god looking down from above and feeling almost nothing about it. The boy who had once picked up a notebook believing he would scrub the world clean was simply gone. Ryuk did not grieve. Death gods are not built for grief. He gazed down at the body of the human who had given him the finest entertainment of his long, gray, boring life, and then he spread his wings and flew home, back to the dull world he had come from, taking nothing with him but the memory of a story well told. To Ryuk, Light had been an interesting tale that had reached its final page, and that was all he had ever been. As Light's life flickered out, the story closed on one small, quiet picture, a thin, curved moon hanging alone in the night sky. It is an easy thing to overlook, yet it was placed there with care. In Light's own language, the word for the moon is hidden right inside the way his name is written on the page. The story said goodbye to its main character, with a small and sorrowful little joke. The moon left standing in for the man, both of them glowing with a cold, borrowed light that had never truly been their own to give. There was a harsh kind of fairness in the way Light went out. He spent the whole story fooling everyone who ever trusted him, and in the end, he was finished off by the single being he never managed to fool, the one who had told him the plain truth on the first day and then simply kept his word. Light built an entire kingdom out of lies and forgot the one honest fact sitting at the bottom of all of it, that the power had never been his, and the watcher at his shoulder had never been his friend. Everything the ending shows keeps pointing back to one idea. Light spent years convinced he had climbed above ordinary people and turned into something close to a god. The way he died lays bare how wrong that belief always was. A god does not get used by a bored creature for sport. A god does not die alone on a staircase because someone shut a notebook. From the very first page to the very last, Light was only ever a clever, proud, frightened human who happened to pick up a terrible thing, and the death god calmly writing his name is the final, plain proof of it. The certainty he carried into that warehouse, the trap that copied his own trick, the two rivals who closed in from opposite ends of the world, the bullets, and now the death god's pen, all of it tells the very same story from different sides. A person really can fool the whole world for a while. A person cannot fool the way the world itself actually works. And the notebook, in the end, had always been a piece of how the world itself actually works. That is how Light Yagami dies in the version most people have watched, the one that played out on screen, quiet and lonely, and oddly gentle for a man who had caused so much death, sent off with a vision of his oldest enemy and a sliver of moon to light the way out. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That soft, lonely ending is only one of two, though. The original telling, the one drawn on paper long before the screen version ever existed, carried Light out of the world in a far different way, rougher and uglier, and much less kind to him. The choice between those two endings changes everything about how a person is meant to feel in the moment Light draws his final breath, and the wide gap between the two is well worth standing in and looking at closely. Section 6. Two different goodbyes. There are, in the end, two official versions of how Light Yagami leaves the world, and they are not the same. The bones of the story match in both. Light is exposed inside the warehouse. The death god writes his name, and Light dies. But the way the story carries him from that warehouse floor to his final breath is told in two very different ways, and the gap between them is much wider than it first appears to be. The reason there are two of them comes down to how the story itself was made. It began as a drawn comic, page after page of black and white art printed in a magazine, written and drawn long before any screen version of it existed. That comic is where the original ending lives. Later, the cartoon version came along and brought the whole tale to life, with color, with voices, and with music. When it reached the final stretch, the people making the cartoon chose to change several important things about the way Light dies. Both versions are real. Both are fully official, both blessed by the same creators. They simply choose to say goodbye in different ways. The first big change is what happens to Mikami, Light's most loyal follower. In the drawn comic, when the trap snaps shut and Light stands revealed as nothing more than an ordinary man, Mikami does something crushing. He turns on Light completely. The man who had worshipped Light as a living god takes one long look at the cornered, exposed, lying human in front of him and rejects him right there on the spot, spitting out that Light is not a god at all, but filth, scum, garbage. The god he had handed his whole life over to was a fake, and the very moment he sees it, his worship curdles into pure disgust. The drawn comic does not even end Mikami's story inside the warehouse. After he turns on Light and is hauled away, the comic lets him live a little while longer, only to die roughly 10 days after Light does, alone and in custody, in a way the story never fully spells out. Some readers believe Nier quietly used the notebook to remove him, since Mikami had become a loose end who knew far too much, though the story never once comes out and confirms it. His death is left in shadow, off the page, an uneasy little footnote to a man who gave away everything he had for a god who never deserved a single piece of it. The cartoon version handles Mikami in a completely different way. There, he does not turn against Light or call him names. Instead, lost and shattered by the collapse of everything he had ever believed in, Mikami takes the very pen he had been writing with and drives it straight into his own body, ending his own life right there on the warehouse floor. It is sudden, it is shocking, and it is shockingly bloody. The blood bursting out of him in a way the show clearly wants to be hard to watch. The whole room is thrown into chaos for a moment. That moment of confusion is no small thing at all, because it is the exact gap that lets Light slip away. That single change, whether Mikami kills himself or not, decides where Light gets to spend his final minutes alive. In the drawn comic, Mikami causes no distraction, so there is no opening and no chance to run. Light is trapped. He dies right there in the same warehouse where his lies were torn wide open, surrounded by the people who now know exactly what he is, with nowhere left to hide and no way out at all. In the cartoon, the chaos of Mikami's death hands Light his one opening, and he takes it. Wounded and bleeding badly, he drags himself out of the warehouse and away into the dark, running on nothing but raw desperation. He does not get very far. He collapses onto an empty flight of stairs, completely alone, and that lonely staircase, rather than the warehouse, is where the cartoon chooses to let him die. The change pulls his death away from the eyes of his enemies and tucks it into a quiet, solitary place where no one is left to watch him go. The biggest difference of all is the feeling of the death itself. In the drawn comic, Light goes out in the ugliest way a person possibly can. When he finally understands that the death god has written his name and there is no escaping it, he meets that knowledge with no pride and no calm whatsoever. He breaks down. He begs. He pleads for his life, scrambling and frantic, clutching at anyone and anything. A grown man crumbling into a frightened, sniveling mess in his last moments on Earth. The comic strips away every last scrap of the cool, godlike image that Light had spent the whole story carefully building. He dies small, scared, and pitiful, and the comic wants the reader to see every bit of it. The comic pushes that final humiliation remarkably far. For the entire story, Light's greatest weapon was his calm, the unshakable cool that let him think his way out of every corner while everyone around him panicked. Watching that calm shatter completely, watching the smartest and proudest person in the room dissolve into tears and pleading, takes away the one quality that ever made him frightening. By the time the Death God finishes writing his name, there is nothing left of the god of a new world, only a desperate man who would say anything, promise anything, and do anything to buy himself a few more seconds of life. The comic refuses him even the small mercy of a quiet exit. The cartoon chooses a softer, sadder path. As Light dies on those stairs, the screen fills with quick flashes of memory, glimpses of him as a young boy, back when he was just a bright, ordinary kid with a good life ahead of him and no notebook anywhere near his hands. The figure of L, his old enemy, appears across from him, calm and silent. There is far less begging here, far less panic, far less clawing at survival. The cartoon lets Light die almost at peace, and it gently asks the audience to feel real sorrow for the person he could have been if everything had gone another way. Those flashbacks of his childhood are doing quiet, careful work. They drag the audience back, just for a heartbeat, to a time before any of the killing, before the power, before the pride, to a normal boy who studied hard and was loved by his family and had every door in the world open to him. Holding that image of the boy right next to the body of the man he became is a deliberate choice. It forces a single sad thought into the moment of his death, the thought of just how much was thrown away, and how a life that could have gone almost anywhere ended up here, on a cold staircase, written off by a bored creature with a pen. The way the two versions treat Mikami carries a quiet weight worth sitting with. In the drawn comic, even Light's most devoted believer abandons him the second the mask falls. That points straight at a hard truth. The worship was never truly about Light, the person. It was about the mighty god that people had imagined him to be. And the instant that god is shown to be only a sweaty, cornered man, the worship dies on the spot and twists itself into disgust. The cartoon, by keeping Mikami loyal right to the very end, loyal enough to take his own life for him, paints a slightly different picture, one where the belief ran deep enough that the loss of it was simply unbearable to live with. The two endings leave a person holding two completely different feelings, and that is the real heart of why the choice matters so much. The drawn comic ending is built to satisfy. After watching Light lie, kill, and betray for the entire length of the story, after watching him fool every single person who ever trusted him, there is a grim sort of justice in seeing him stripped down to a begging coward and then snuffed out without a shred of dignity left. The monster gets a monster's end. The people who spent the whole story wanting to watch him truly pay for it walk away feeling that he finally did. The cartoon ending reaches for something else entirely. By showing the bright child Light once was, by bringing back the quiet image of L, by letting him die softly instead of screaming, the cartoon steers the audience towards sadness rather than satisfaction. It raises a much harder question. What exactly was lost when this gifted boy threw his life away chasing the idea of becoming a god? The cartoon mourns him. It treats his death less like the clean defeat of a villain and far more like the heartbreaking waste of a person who could have been so much more than what he chose to become. Underneath that split sits a deeper disagreement about people in general. The drawn comic seems to argue that a person who does what Light did has earned only contempt, and that the right response to his death is plain, cold judgment. The cartoon seems to argue that even a person who does terrible things was once a human being with promise, and that some sorrow is owed to the waste of that promise. Even now, neither view is foolish. The story leaves both doors standing open, and which one a person walks through often says as much about them as it does about Light. Because of all this, fans have argued for years over which ending is the better one, and the argument splits cleanly right down the middle. One side prefers the drawn comic, saying the harsh, undignified, satisfying death is the only fitting end for a man who did the things Light did, and that softening it lets him off far too easy. The other side prefers the cartoon, saying the gentler, sadder ending does more justice to Light as a character. reminding everyone that underneath the monster, there had always been a real human being who simply lost his way. Both sides hold a genuine point, which is exactly why the debate has never once settled. People who have studied the ending closely often note that the cartoon's final 2 episodes work best when watched back to back, as one single unbroken piece, since the exposure and the death were always meant to flow straight into each other. The moment Matsuda finally fires on Light is regularly singled out as one of the most powerful in the whole story. The point where years of buried tension and quiet betrayal burst out all at once in a single burst of gunfire. Reviewers at the time praised the ending very highly, and it has held on to that strong reputation in all the years since. The cartoon's version of the ending also carried a stronger warning than any other part of the series ever did, marking it as far more graphic than anything that had come before it. The bloodshed of Mikami's death and the gunfire that brings Light down made the final stretch the harshest the show ever put on a screen. The choice was a deliberate one. After a story that often kept its violence clean and distant, with criminals dropping quietly from far away, the ending forces the camera to stay close to the mess and the pain of it, so that the 2 men who handed out so much death do not get to be spared the sight of it themselves. There is one more quiet difference tucked into the very last moments. In the final pages of the drawn comic, after Light is already gone, the story shows ordinary people still gathered together to worship Kira, clinging to their belief in a god who is already dead and is never coming back. It is an unsettling little picture, a hint that the idea of Kira might somehow outlive the man himself. The cartoon leaves these worshippers out completely. Both versions, though, close on the same small image of a thin, curved moon in the sky, the quiet little sign-off that ties the very last frame back to Light's own name. For all of these differences, the most important beats stay exactly the same in both versions, and that matters every bit as much as the changes do. In both, Light is brought down by the very same trap. In both, the same young man, Matsuda, fires the shots that break him apart. And in both, no matter where he dies or how much he begs, the hand that finally ends his life belongs to the death god, Ryuk, keeping the promise he made on the very first day they met. The core truth survives every single change. The power was never Light's to begin with, and the watcher hanging behind him was never once his friend. This is where the 2 endings, different as they are, end up making the exact same point. The whole story has been about a man who talked himself into believing he had risen above all other people and turned into something like a god. The drawn comic proves him wrong by stripping him down to a terrified, begging coward, showing the small, frightened human that had been hiding under the godlike act the entire time. The cartoon proves him wrong from the other direction, by reminding everyone of the ordinary boy he started out as, the plain human life he simply threw away. 2 very different roads, both leading to the same place, the simple fact that Light Yagami was never a god and never could have become one. For anyone trying to explain this ending, the version they choose to lean on quietly shapes the whole meaning of it. Lead with the drawn comic, and the story becomes a tale about a monster getting precisely what he deserved. Lead with the cartoon, and it becomes a tragedy about wasted promise and a bright life thrown straight into the fire. The same character, the same death, and yet 2 completely different lessons depending entirely on which goodbye gets told. The cartoon version is the one most people have actually seen, since moving pictures with sound and color reach far more eyes than a black and white comic ever could. For that reason, the gentle, sorrowful, lonely staircase death has become the ending that lives in most people's memories. The begging, undignified comic death is, for a great many people, a genuine surprise they only stumble across later, often with a real jolt, when they finally go back and read the original pages for themselves. That jolt is a big part of what makes the comparisons so interesting in the first place. Someone who grew up feeling a little sad for Light, who remembered his quiet death and the small flashes of his childhood, can open the original comic and find a completely different man waiting in those final panels. A man with no dignity left at all. One who weeps and begs and grabs at any thread of survival he can reach. Meeting that version for the very first time can shift how a person feels about the whole story, and about whether Light ever truly deserved a single drop of sympathy. So the 2 endings pull hard in 2 directions, one toward contempt and one toward sorrow. One harsh and one gentle. One inside a warehouse and one out alone on a staircase. They flatly disagree about how a person is meant to feel in the moment Light takes his final breath. On one single point, though, they do not disagree even slightly, and it happens to be the strangest and most important point in the entire ending. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Both versions close with Light simply dying, and the story is oddly clear about what comes next for him, and for every other person who has ever lived. It is a single, deliberate idea the author built straight into the rules of the notebook itself, and then refused to ever change, no matter who asked him to. That one idea is the real key that unlocks the whole meaning of the ending, and it quietly answers a question that people have argued over for years. Where does Light Yagami actually go once he dies? Section 7. Where everyone goes. Once Light's name is written down and his heart finally stops, the story has to answer a question that every tale about death eventually runs into. Where does he go now? Most stories offer a comforting answer to that, or a frightening one. This story gives an answer that is stranger and colder than either. And the truly unsettling part is that it gives the exact same answer for Light that it gives for every other person who has ever lived. The clue was planted on the very first day, right alongside the promise. When Ryuk first explained the notebook to Light, he slipped a quiet warning in among the rules. He told Light that no human who uses the notebook should expect to land in a good place or a bad place after they die. Light, drunk on his shiny new power, waved the warning off without a second thought. Yet that single line has gone on to confuse people for years and years. For a long time, a great many readers and watchers took that warning to mean something very specific and very scary. They thought it meant that anyone who so much as picked up the notebook had doomed themselves, that using it slammed the door on any reward after death and maybe even locked them into some special punishment built just for notebook users. It felt like a curse stitched onto the power itself, a price tag hanging off of every single name a person wrote. The truth is both far simpler and far heavier than any curse could be. The notebook does not ship its users off to some special bad place, because there is no special bad place, and there is no special good place waiting for anyone either. The rule reaches far past the people who use the notebook. It stretches out to cover every human being who has ever drawn a breath. According to the story, when any person dies, they do not travel anywhere at all. There is no life waiting on the other side of death. There are no soft clouds and no roaring fire, no judgment, no reward, and no punishment. There is only nothingness, a complete and total end, and it is the very same end for every single person without exception. The original story even keeps a special little word for it, a short, plain word that simply means nothing, a place that is somehow not a place at all. The rule is even stricter than it first sounds. Some people have guessed that maybe the dead float up to become death gods themselves, rising into that gray world the creatures come from, or that perhaps a person is born again as someone brand new somewhere far down the line. The story quietly shuts every single one of those doors. The gray world of the death gods is not a waiting room and not a second life for dead humans. Nobody is reborn. Nobody lingers behind as a ghost. The dead do not turn into anything at all, because turning into something would still count as a kind of existing, and the whole hard point of the rule is that existing is exactly the thing that stops. This is the idea the story holds back and saves for the very end, and it lands at the exact moment Light is dying. As his life drains out of him, the truth gets spoken plainly, the one truth he spent his whole life refusing to hear. There is no heaven, and there is no hell. No matter what a person does while they are alive, kind or cruel, gentle or monstrous, every last one of them ends up in the very same place the moment they die. Death treats every person exactly the same. Who actually speaks that truth depends on which version a person is looking at. In the original drawn comic, it is the death god himself who says it to Light at the end. A final cold fact pressed into the dying man's mind by the very creature who set all of it in motion. In the cartoon version, the same idea is handed instead to L, Light's old enemy, which makes it land like a quiet last word drifting back from the grave. Either way, the message is word for word the same, and it is aimed straight at the center of everything Light ever believed. Looking back, Ryuk's first day warning takes on a much darker shine. He was telling Light, right there at the very start, that the power in his hands would buy him absolutely nothing on the far side of death, that the road he was so eager to walk led to the same blank ending as every other road. Light heard those words as a small scrap of fine print and brushed them aside, far too busy picturing the throne he was going to build. The death god was calmly describing the exact shape of Light's final moment, years and years before it ever arrived. And Light was the single person in the whole world too proud to actually listen. None of this happened by accident. The man who wrote the story has said, plainly and more than once, that of every single thing inside it, this was the one rule he flatly refused to ever let anyone change. When you die, he insisted, you simply become nothing. He gripped that idea tightly from the very beginning all the way through to the very end, and he was openly glad he managed to hold on to it. He even made sure, with his own hand, that the word for nothingness was printed right onto the page where Light dies, rather than leaving such a thing to chance. His reasons were simple, and they say a great deal about the whole story. For one, he wanted death in this world to be truly final. If dead characters were allowed to come strolling back, he felt it would be a kind of cheating, a cheap little trick that would quietly drain all the danger and weight out of everything. Making death equal to nothingness meant that once a person was gone, they were gone for good, with no takebacks, no rescues, and no secret escape hatch tucked away somewhere. There was a second reason behind it too. The writer did not want his story to twist itself into a long argument about good and evil, and what people deserve after they die. The instant a story hands out a heaven for the good and a hell for the wicked, it has to start deciding who counts as which, and he had no interest at all in sitting in that judge's chair. By making the answer identical for every person, he stepped neatly around the entire debate. The story got to stay a story, a dark and gripping one, rather than slowly curdling into a lecture about right and wrong. Once that rule is fully understood, it changes the feel of the whole ending, because it points like an arrow straight at the single belief Light built his entire life upon. Light spent years dead certain that some people deserve to live while others deserve to die, that he stood high above ordinary humans as the one person fit to judge them all. The deepest rule of his own world answers him back with a flat, quiet refusal. In death, there is no above and there is no below. The one who judges and the ones who get judged all tumble into the exact same nothing. The meaning of that rule for Light himself runs painfully deep. Every criminal he ever struck down, every innocent person caught and crushed along the way, the detective L, his own honest father, the loyal followers who threw away their lives for him, and Light himself at the very last, all of them arrive at one identical end. The thousands he wiped out while believing with all his heart that they were beneath him are now perfectly, completely equal to him. The new world he dreamed of ruling keeps no special golden throne for its god. It holds out the very same empty nothing for him that it holds for the lowest, cruelest criminal he ever erased with a stroke of his pen. The very same rule reaches the people Light hurt the most, and it does not spare a single one of them either, which carries its own quiet sadness. L, the brilliant detective who gave up his life trying to stop Kira, did not earn any reward for it. Light's father, an honest man who served the law right up to his very last breath, did not earn one either. They drifted off into the exact same nothing as the criminal's Light spent his nights hunting. The rule is fair in the harshest way a rule can possibly be fair. Fair enough to be almost too much to bear, because it means that goodness buys a person no more on the other side of death than cruelty does. That rule quietly knocks the legs out from under everything Kira ever stood for. Light killed in the name of a higher justice, a cleaner world, a reward for the good, and a punishment for the wicked. A world with no life after death has no higher justice waiting anywhere to sort any of that out. There is no great scorekeeper in the sky handing out prizes and penalties, no final court sitting above the human one. Light crowned himself the god of a world that, by its own deepest rules, has no gods at all and no heaven for a single soul to reach. His whole grand mission stood on a foundation that was simply never there. There is a bitter joke buried deep inside all of this. Light killed because he was convinced the world badly needed someone to punish the wicked, someone to make absolutely sure that bad people got everything that was coming to them. A world with no life waiting after death is a world where bad people, left completely alone, would simply die like everybody else and slide off into the same blank nothing. By crowning himself the Great Punisher, Light was not filling some gap that the universe had carelessly left open. The universe had never planned to punish anyone in the first place, because in the end, it punishes no one and rewards no one at all. Light invented a job that did not exist, and then he killed thousands of people trying to do it. The rule also quietly settles something from his final moments. In the cartoon, the dying Light sees the figure of L standing right in front of him, and it is tempting to read that as L's spirit returning to watch his great enemy fall at last. The rule about nothingness makes that reading very hard to hold on to. If not one person lives on past death, then L is not truly standing there. The figure is far more likely a picture Light's own fading mind stitched together in its last few seconds. The face of the one man who ever beat him rising up as everything goes dark. Even his very last vision is no visit from beyond. It is only his own dying brain flickering out. There is something deeply cold in this way of looking at death, and the story knows it perfectly well. No villain gets dragged down screaming into a pit of fire. No hero gets gently carried up into a peaceful reward. The decent and the monstrous alike simply stop, lying side by side, equal in the dark. The story refuses the comfort that most tales about death like to offer, the soothing notion that everything balances out in the end, and each person collects exactly what they earned. In this world, nobody collects what they earned. They all just collect the same nothing. This is a big part of why the ending stays lodged so firmly in people's minds long after the story itself is over. A neat and tidy ending would have shipped Light off to some fiery punishment and let everyone nod along that justice had finally been served. A soft and kindly ending would have handed him a gentle peace that he had done nothing to earn. The story flatly refuses to do either one. It gives him the very same plain nothing it gives to the gentlest, warmest person who ever drew breath, and then it leaves the audience alone to sit with exactly how that lands. There is no clean little lesson stamped across the final page. Only a rule, stated flatly and without apology, and a body cooling on a staircase. And yet that cold rule says something very sharp about how Light chose to spend his life. If death wipes everyone out equally, then the only thing that ever truly mattered was the living of it. The world Light actually touched, the people he actually killed, the family he actually lied to, the long years he actually threw away, that was the entire sum of it. There was no grand reward riding in afterward to make the killing worthwhile, and no grand punishment riding in to balance the scales. The harm was simply the harm, and then he was gone. Looked at through that rule, Light's life reads as a staggering, almost unbelievable waste. He took genuinely rare gifts, a razor-sharp mind and a wide-open future, and he poured every bit of them into building a kingdom of corpses, all in the chase for a godhood that the universe he lived in flatly does not allow to exist. He gave up his family, his friends, his own future, and at the very end, his life itself, all in pursuit of a reward after death that was never once on the table for anyone, saint or sinner. He spent everything he had for nothing, and nothing is precisely what he was handed in return. Every door that had once stood wide open to him, he closed with his own two hands, one after the other, until the only thing left waiting in front of him was the dark. This is the final and deepest proof of the idea that is quietly run beneath the whole ending. Light wanted so badly to be a god, to be something more than human, something that stood apart from and above the crowd. The rule of nothingness drags him all the way back down to earth and sets him perfectly level with every human who has ever lived and died. A god might reasonably expect some special fate of his own. Light received the common one, the same one shared by all. The plainest, most ordinary fact about him, the very thing he fought the hardest his whole life to escape, was that he was just a person. And people die the same death that all other people die. For some, this is the bleakest ending imaginable. A story that calmly declares nothing a person does echoes on past their final breath. For others, there is an odd and quiet fairness buried in it. A strange comfort in knowing that no cruelty gets to win forever, and no power lasts even 1 second past the grave. The story does not bother telling anyone which way they ought to feel about it. It simply states the rule, lets Light die underneath it, and leaves the rest of it hanging there in the silent air. So the answer to the great question of where Light Yagami goes, after all the killing and all the scheming and all the towering dreams of a brand new world, is that he goes nowhere whatsoever. He becomes nothing. The very same nothing as every other person, and the universe does not so much as pause to mark the difference between the god he imagined himself to be and the plain, frightened man he turned out to actually be. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The nothing that swallowed Light was not the end of the story, though. The world he had fought so desperately to remake was still out there, still spinning along, still crowded with living people who now had to figure out what on earth to make of the years they had all spent under Kira's long shadow. Light was gone for good. The question of whether he had truly changed anything at all, whether the rivers of death he set loose had meant something real or had truly meant nothing, was a question only the living could ever hope to answer. And the story still had a little more asking left to do. Section 8. The world he left behind. With Light gone into the nothing the story had promised him, the people he left behind still had to keep on living, and the world he had sworn he would remake still had to keep on turning without him in it. What became of those people, and of that world, is the last real piece of the whole puzzle, and it carries a quiet, heavy answer to the question of whether any of his killing ever amounted to a single thing. Misa comes first, the young woman who had loved Light more deeply than anyone else ever did. By the very end, she was no mastermind and no fighter. She was simply a person who had handed her whole heart over to Light, who had helped him and worshipped him and asked for almost nothing in return except to be loved back. She never knew the full weight of everything he had done in the dark. All she knew was that the one person she had built her entire life around was suddenly, completely gone. The story does not show exactly what becomes of her. The last glimpse it offers is a quiet and haunting one. Misa appears on the rooftop of an old building tied to the whole Kira case, standing alone near the low rail at the very edge, dressed in the outfit she so often wore. That picture is left hanging there on purpose. The people who made the story chose not to spell her fate out, leaving it for each person who watches to settle quietly in their own mind. Even so, the heavy hint is almost impossible to miss. A grieving woman, standing alone on a rooftop edge after losing the only thing she had ever lived for, is not a hopeful image by any measure. Most people who reach that final scene come away believing that Misa, unable to face a world that no longer had light anywhere in it, chose to end her own life up on that roof. The story never once says the words out loud, and yet it points so clearly that the silence almost speaks them on its own. There is a deep sadness in where Misa ends up. Of every person tangled in the Kira case, she may well be the one who paid the steepest price of all for loving the wrong man. Light had used her again and again, treating her like a handy tool when she was useful to him, and shoving her aside the moment she was not. And she poured out her devotion anyway. The shining new world he kept promising was never going to hold any real place for her. In the end, she was just one more life quietly wrecked by a man who saw the people around him as pieces to be moved across a board. Misa's place in all of this carries a strange and bitter twist. In the eyes of the law, she was the one person on Kira's side who simply walked away free. The others ended up dead or captured, yet Misa was never arrested, never put on trial, never made to answer for any of it. Her memories had been stripped from her more than once over the course of the story. Even so, being free in the eyes of the law did her no good whatsoever. She lost the only thing she had ever truly wanted, and no law anywhere could touch the grief that came flooding in to take its place. She escaped every cage except the one that actually mattered. The people who finally beat Light, meanwhile, carried on. Nier, the calm young man who had at last cornered Kira, stepped into the empty space that the great detective L had left behind when he died. He took up the name L for himself and became the new face of that hidden role, the world's quiet protector working from the shadows, exactly the way the first L had done before him. The line did not snap when L was killed. It simply passed along to the one person who had finally proven himself worthy of carrying it. The way Nier steps into the role of L is quietly telling all on its own. The first L had been pulled into a long, dangerous, deeply personal duel with Light, a battle of two great minds that ate up years of both their lives and finally cost L everything he had. Nier, faced later with a fresh killer waving around the same kind of power, simply declines the duel altogether. He had learned, perhaps, the single most important lesson the whole Kira affair ever had to teach, which is that taking a killer seriously is part of what hands that killer their power in the first place. By flatly refusing to treat the copycat as any kind of worthy opponent, Nier starves the new Kira of the one thing every Kira truly needs to survive, which is to be feared and to be believed in. The part that says the most about whether Light truly mattered is what happened to the idea of Kira itself. Killing Light did not wipe the idea of Kira out of people's minds. For years, he had ruled through fear and through worship together, and a great many ordinary people had come to love the thought of a mighty figure standing somewhere above them, punishing the wicked. That idea did not die on the staircase alongside him. It lingered in the world like smoke long after a fire, an argument that flatly refused to settle, a hunger that some people still quietly carried around inside themselves. During the years Light had ruled from the shadows, the world really had changed, in ways that are deeply uncomfortable to look straight at. Crime had dropped off sharply. Major wars had gone quiet. All across the globe, people had grown far too afraid of the unseen judge who might write their name to ever step out of line. And so they behaved themselves. For a stretch of time, going by the cold numbers alone, Kira's long reign of fear had seemed to actually be working. That ugly fact had always sat right at the dark heart of the whole story. The nagging worry that a monster's cruel methods might somehow be getting real results out in the world. The clearest look at what the world actually became comes from a short follow-up chapter, set 3 full years after the Kira case was finally closed for good. It is a small and simple story, but it answers the single biggest question the ending leaves hanging in the air. The question of whether Light Yagami ever truly changed the world the way he had always sworn that he would. In that follow-up, a brand new killer steps forward, seeming to pick up right where Kira had left off. This new person had gotten hold of one of the Death God's notebooks, passed down through the very same kind of strange bargain that had started the whole story in the first place. Rather than hunting down criminals the way Light once had, though, this new killer did something noticeably different. They began writing the names of old, sick people who were suffering badly and wished to die, claiming all the while to be setting them free from their pain. The notebook this copycat used had slipped into the human world through a death god named Medora, who had won herself an extra notebook from the king of the death gods by bribing him with a pile of apples carried up out of the human world. The tiny, almost silly nature of that bargain, a weapon that can end any life traded away for a handful of fruit, quietly shows just how little the death gods truly care about the lives their toys go on to destroy. To them, it had been nothing but a game back then, and it was still nothing but a game now. The fresh wave of killings set the entire world arguing all over again. People climbed onto television to fight about it, one side openly hoping that Kira had finally returned to scrub the world clean, the other side horrified that the old nightmare might be cranking back to life. The old fever came rushing straight back in. For one tense stretch, it truly looked as though the whole terrible cycle might be about to spin itself up a second time, with a fresh god rising to sit in judgment over the living. The fierce public argument the copycat stirred up tells its own quiet story about people. Years had gone by. The original Kira was long dead and buried, and still, the very moment the killings began again, crowds rushed to take sides as though no time at all had passed. Some openly begged for Kira to come back and fix the broken world. Others recoiled in plain dread. The hunger that Light had spent years feeding never fully starved. And Nier, watching the whole thing play out, leaned on something the First L had once quietly admitted, that he chased difficult cases far less out of pure justice, and far more because he simply enjoyed untangling a hard puzzle. This puzzle was not a hard one. Nier already knew the answer to it. So, much like the man he had replaced, he just turned his back on a case that did not interest him. The new L, Nier, watched all of this unfold and then did something that almost nobody saw coming. He flatly refused to play the game. Rather than launching some grand hidden battle the way the First L had once waged against Light, Nier simply went on television himself, speaking as L, and announced plainly that he had no interest in this case whatsoever. He called this new killer nothing more than a cheap, disgusting murderer, very plainly not the real Kira at all, and not worth his time or one moment of anyone's fear. The reasoning behind that cold dismissal is quietly brilliant. Nier had understood something about this copycat that drained away all of their power. The original Kira had been a true believer, certain right down in his bones that he was building a better world, and that rock-hard certainty was a real part of what made him so frightening to everyone. This new killer carried no such fire inside them. They were a pale imitation, and Nier could already see exactly how they killed and exactly how he would catch them, which made the whole case dull rather than dangerous. So he treated it as dull, out loud, for the entire watching world to hear him do it. What happened next proved Nier completely and utterly right. The new killer, shaken and humiliated at being brushed off as a worthless fake in front of the whole world, simply could not stand it. Stripped of the fear and the respect they had been so desperately chasing, with even the world's greatest detective openly refusing to take them seriously, the copycat gave up on everything. They wrote down their own name in the notebook and ended their own life with it. The entire threat collapsed without any clever trap at all, brought down by a single public shrug from a man who would not be bothered. That short follow-up says something very sharp by holding the two Kiras up side by side against each other. The copycat had held the same power Light once did, the very same deadly notebook resting in their hands. What the copycat completely lacked was Light's terrifying certainty, his iron belief that he stood in the right. Once that belief was missing, the raw power all by itself turned out to mean almost nothing. A frightened imitation clutching a god's weapon folded up the very instant a single person refused to be afraid of them. It strongly suggests that a great deal of Light's power had never truly lived in the notebook at all. It had lived in the fear and the worship he managed to build up around himself. Seen from a distance, the answer to the great question of Light's life turns painfully clear. He had dreamed of remaking the whole entire world into a flawless place, a clean new world where he ruled as a living god and evil itself simply would not dare to exist anymore. 3 years after his death, what was actually left of all of that grand dreaming? Not a flawless world, not a lasting kingdom of any kind. Only a stubborn argument that would not fully die, and one sad copycat who killed dying old people and then killed himself the moment he was finally ignored. The towering new world had shrunk all the way down to just that. The hardest truth tucked inside all of it is how easily the world simply moved on without him. The man who had been so sure he was the single most important person alive, the one figure holding the entire world together with the strength of his own judgment, turned out to be something the world could quietly absorb and then carry right past. People kept on living their lives. The new L kept his patient watch. The debate rumbled on somewhere in the background like a stretch of old weather. The god who had believed that absolutely everything depended on him left behind a world that, for the most part, just kept on going as it always had. The most unsettling thread running through the whole aftermath is how plainly the idea of Kira outlived the man who built it. Light was nothing now, scattered into the same blank nothing as every other person, and yet the dream he had planted kept twitching along without him. People still argued for it out loud. A complete stranger still tried to pick up his fallen crown. The original ending of the drawn comic had pointed at this very thing directly, showing ordinary people still gathered together to worship a dead god who was never once coming back to them. A man can be shot and killed in a single afternoon. An idea, once it has sunk its roots down into enough frightened and hopeful minds, turns out to be a far harder thing to ever fully bury. And the death god who had started the whole thing in motion? Ryuk had not changed even one tiny bit. At the close of that follow-up, the copycat's notebook found its way back home to the death gods, and Ryuk happily scooped it up for himself. The same bored creature who had once dropped a notebook down into Light's quiet life, purely to see what might happen next, was right back exactly where he had begun, holding a fresh new notebook in his hands, simply waiting for the next interesting human to wander along. That waiting did not stretch on forever either. Years further down the road, the same death god would drop a notebook once again, this time into the hands of yet another brilliant young person, hoping to see another fine show like the one Light had given him so long ago. The game between the bored death gods and the humans who keep picking up their notebooks does not end just because one player happens to die. It only pauses for a while, and then it quietly starts over, because there is always another bored creature up there, and always another person down here, ready to believe that they alone can handle the power. The whole of it circles right back to the idea that is run beneath this entire ending. Light spent his life dead certain that he was a god, certain the world simply could not do without him, certain his judgment was busy reshaping everything around him. The world he left behind answered every single part of that. It buried him in the very same nothing as everyone else. It moved on without all that much trouble, and the closest thing to his grand return was a hollow little copy that crumbled to dust in a single afternoon. The man who wanted so badly to be everything ended up, in the world's long memory, as just one more dark chapter that came and then quietly passed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So the people are scattered now, the copycat is gone, the new L keeps his quiet watch over the world, and a bored death god holds a fresh notebook somewhere far away. Only one thing is left to do, which is to step back and ask what the whole story, from that first dropped notebook to this last quiet shrug, finally adds up to. Section 9. What it all adds up to. After the death, the trap, the two endings, the blank nothing, and the quiet world that carried right on without him, one big question is left standing in the middle of it all. What was the whole thing actually about? A story does not spend that many hours building toward a single man's death without trying to say something real with it. The ending is the place where the story finally says that something out loud, and the message tucked inside it is far sharper than it first appears to be. For a long stretch, the story pulls off a sneaky and clever trick. It plants the audience right inside Light's own head. It lets people feel the rush of his power, cheer along with his clever escapes, and quietly agree, at least a little, that maybe the world really would be a better place with the worst people gone from it. The ending is where the story collects on all of that. After spending so long pulling everyone in close to Light, It forces them to watch exactly where his road leads, and it does not look away for a second. The first thing the ending makes plain is what the power slowly did to Light over time. Back at the very beginning, a fair case can be made that Light meant well, in his own badly twisted way. He looked out at a world stuffed full of cruelty, and he wanted to fix it. Whatever a person decides to think about that wish, it did start as something close to a desire to do some good in the world. What the story shows, one careful step at a time, is that desire rotting away from the inside out. The young man who began by writing down dangerous criminals ended up writing down police officers who were only doing their jobs, agents who were merely investigating him, and absolutely anyone at all who happened to get between him and his secret. He used the people who loved him and tossed them aside the moment they stopped being useful to him. He let his own honest father die still believing in a son who had quietly turned into a monster. By the end, the line between the criminals Light punished and Light himself had nearly disappeared completely. That slow rotting is one of the ending's quietest and hardest lessons. The power to decide who lives and who dies did not shape Light into a fair and gentle ruler. It made him worse and worse the longer he held on to it. Every easy kill made the next one a little easier. Every enemy he erased made him a little surer that erasing his enemies was simply the right thing to do. By the time he stood in that warehouse, the bright young man who once wanted to fix the world had become someone willing to murder a whole room full of people just to save his own skin. The ending argues, without ever once stopping to lecture, that no person alive can hold that kind of power for long without being warped by it. The second thing the ending drives home is the danger hiding inside Light's certainty. From the very first day to the very last, Light almost never truly doubted himself. He was completely sure he knew who deserved to die. He was completely sure he was the right person to make that terrible call. That total certainty was the engine behind everything he ever did, and it turned out to be the exact thing that got him killed. A person who is that sure of himself slowly stops checking his own work. Light was so certain he had already won that he gloated out loud in the warehouse before the trap had even snapped shut, and that gloating helped seal his guilt in front of everyone. He was so certain his follower was perfect that he never once imagined a single broken routine could betray him. His certainty had quietly blinded him the entire time, keeping him from spotting the small, ordinary human mistakes closing in from every side. The ending gently suggests that the most dangerous person in any room is very often the one who is utterly sure that he is right. The third thing the ending says comes through the people who actually beat Light, and through one particular choice above all the others. Nier, the young man who finally brought Kira crashing down and then stepped into the role of the world's great detective, was handed, in a quiet sort of way, the chance to become the next god himself. He had the brains for it. He had the will for it. He could easily have decided that he too should sit in judgment over the living. He flatly refused to do any such thing. Nier chose instead to work the way the law itself works, through patience, through proper rules, through plain and ordinary human effort, catching wrongdoers and handing them over rather than deciding their deaths all on his own. That refusal is the story planting its flag firmly in the ground. It draws a hard line between two completely different ways of chasing justice. One way says that a single brilliant person should be trusted to judge and punish everyone else. The other way says that justice belongs to flawed people working together, inside firm limits, checking one another, never lifting any one person up above all the rest. The ending plants itself squarely on the second side. There is a clear reason the story comes down where it does. Light stands as living proof of what happens when one person decides they are wise enough and good enough to hold the power of life and death over everyone around them. No matter how clever that person happens to be, no matter how decent their very first intentions were, the power eats them alive from the inside, and the world they build ends up running purely on fear. The careful, slower, humbler path that the law offers is nowhere near as thrilling, and it makes plenty of its own mistakes along the way. Yet it never once asks any person to become a god, and that, the ending quietly argues, is exactly the thing that keeps it safe. This argument did not actually begin with Nier. It began years earlier, with L. The first great detective and Light had stood for two opposite ideas of justice right from the very start. Light believed that one extraordinary person should rise up and judge the whole world directly. L believed that catching wrongdoers was the slow, patient work of careful people following rules, even when those rules were frustrating and far from perfect. L died long before the end, beaten by Light, and for a while it truly looked as though Light's idea had won the day. The ending quietly turns that around. By having L's chosen successor finish the job and then calmly refuse the throne, the story lets L win the whole argument from beyond the grave. The man himself died, yet the idea he stood for outlasted the very person who killed him. Underneath all three of these lessons sits one simple truth that the ending keeps circling back to, again and again. Light was never a god. He told himself that he was. His followers told him that he was. The frightened world out there half believed it too. The ending takes that whole towering idea and calmly knocks it flat onto the floor. A god does not get outsmarted by two squabbling young men. A god does not get gunned down by a coworker he had carelessly underestimated. A god does not die all alone on a staircase and then vanish into the very same nothing as everyone else. From the first page to the last, Light was a person pretending to be more than a person, and that pretending is the exact lie the ending exists to shatter. This is why the ending feels far less like a simple, cheerful victory and far more like a hard truth being handed over. The story spent dozens of hours letting the audience taste everything Light tasted. The thrill of the power, the rush of getting clean away with it, the tempting idea that maybe the ends really could excuse the means. The ending takes every bit of that and lays down the bill for it. The thrill ends in a lonely death. The power ends in pure nothing. The dream of a better world ends in a sad little copycat and a tired shrug. Everyone who was pulled in close to Light gets made to stare at the wreckage and decide for themselves what any of it was ever truly worth. The story is careful, even right at the end, not to make any of this too easy or too smug. It never once pretends that the world Light wanted was a foolish thing to want. Crime really did fall sharply while he ruled. The wish for a world without cruelty is a wish that nearly every single person quietly shares. People have argued for years, and they still argue hard today, about whether Light had some kind of real point buried somewhere under all his madness, and the story deliberately leaves just enough room for that argument to keep right on going. It refuses to hand anyone a neat little moral with a tidy bow tied on top. What the story flatly does not leave open is the cost. However tempting Light's dream might sound when spoken out loud, the ending shows precisely where that dream leads once a real person actually tries to live it out. It leads to a mountain of bodies, to betrayed and broken families, to a man so completely lost that he can no longer tell the difference between justice and his own survival, and finally to a quiet, meaningless death in the dark. The debate about whether Kira had a point can run on forever. The ending makes very sure that the audience can never quite ignore what chasing that dream actually did to real people. There is one more piece of the ending's argument that is very easy to miss. Light spent the whole story leaning hard on his good intentions, telling himself that wanting a better world somehow made all of his killing acceptable. The ending flatly refuses to let that excuse stand. It does not really matter in the end how clean Light's very first wish might have been, because the thing he actually went on to do was murder thousands of people and crush anyone at all who threatened him. The ending judges him by what he did and by who he became, never once by the comforting story he kept telling himself about it. A kind reason, the story seems to say, does not wash the blood off a cruel act. The harm Light caused was completely real whether or not he believed he was doing right, and believing he was right only ever made him more dangerous than before. A clean reason, in his hands, simply pushed him to kill more. Every single piece of the ending points straight back at these few ideas. The certainty Light carried into that warehouse was the very certainty that doomed him. The trap that finally beat him was built from patient, ordinary watching, the humble and unglamorous kind of work that Light had long ago stopped respecting in anyone. The two rivals who took him down only managed it because they were human enough to be stubborn and divided, the exact kind of messiness that a true god would never have to deal with. The death god who ended his life proved the power had never really been Light's to hold in the first place. The blank nothing that swallowed him whole proved that he was equal, in the very end, to every last person he had ever looked down upon. And the world that calmly moved on without him proved that he had never truly been the center of anything at all, no matter how loudly and how long he had believed that he was. A simpler story would have happily stopped at good beating evil and called it a day. This one reaches a good deal further than that. It is not really content with the plain idea that Light was a bad guy who finally got himself caught. It wants the audience to understand exactly why he lost. And the why turns out to be far bigger than Light alone. He lost because the thing he was straining so hard to become does not exist, and simply cannot exist, because no human being is fit to hold that power. Because certainty that total is always its own kind of blindness. He was undone by the basic shape of reality itself, far more than by any single stroke of bad luck. There is a real reason this story has stayed lodged in people's minds for so long, and a good part of it hides right here in this stretch of the ending. What makes Light frightening is how familiar he feels. He is not a distant alien monster at all. He wanted to make the world a better place. He was sure that he was right. He believed his own way was the only sensible way there was. Those are not the feelings of some far-off creature. They are feelings that nearly every person has had at one time or another. The ending quietly suggests that the long road toward becoming light begins with very ordinary, very human ideas. And that is exactly the thing that makes it worth thinking carefully about. Seen that way, the ending works much more like a warning than like a simple story. It does not really warn against magic notebooks falling out of the sky, since almost nobody is ever going to stumble across one of those. It warns instead against the part of a person that is dead sure it knows best. The part that would gladly fix the whole world by force, if only it had the power to. The part that quietly starts to believe that some people simply matter less than others do. That part lives inside far more people than would ever stand up and admit to it. And the ending holds Light up like a mirror to show plainly where it can lead. The phrase, "Light loved more than any other," was a new world. He said it constantly, dreaming aloud of a clean, bright place built entirely on his own judgment, with himself seated at the very top of it. The ending takes that exact phrase and turns it ice cold. The new world he actually managed to build was one where frightened people informed on each other, where speaking a single word against Kira could get a person killed, where raw fear was forced to do all the work that kindness was supposed to do. And the very moment he died, even that fearful order began to crack apart, because it had never once rested on anything solid underneath. A world held together only by the dread of one hidden killer was never new in any real sense. Underneath the fear, it stayed the same old world it had always been, and the instant the knife at its throat was finally gone, it slid right back to exactly what it was before. So the question of what the whole thing adds up to finally has an answer. It is a patient, careful, deeply human argument that no single person should ever be trusted with the power of a god, that total certainty is a quiet trap waiting to close, and that real justice has to stay in the hands of ordinary, limited, cooperating people who keep one another honest. The story makes that whole argument not with a grand speech but with a cooling body on a staircase and a wide world that barely even pauses to notice that he is gone. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And yet an argument, however sharp and however true, is almost never the real reason a story refuses to fade out of people's minds for close to 20 long years. There is something about this one particular ending, something living well beyond its lesson, that keeps drawing brand new viewers in and keeps the old ones circling back to argue over it, long after they already know every beat by heart. That strange and lasting hold, the real reason this ending above so many others has stuck the way it has, is the very last thing left worth understanding about it. Section 10. Why it never lets go. A clear argument and a clever trap can earn a story plenty of respect. Neither one of those, all on its own, is usually enough to keep people talking about an ending for close to 20 years straight. This ending has that rare staying power, and the reasons behind it run a good deal deeper than the lesson tucked inside it. Part of it is simple enough. The ending is built out of moments that flatly refuse to leave a person's memory. The long, slow count where nobody dies, and the smile drains away from Light's face. The shot from Matsuda, fired by the one man who had believed in Light the very longest. The death god's pen moving steadily across the page. The cold, lonely staircase at the end. These are the kind of images that lodge themselves in the mind for years, quietly replaying on their own, long after the story itself is finished. A story can argue all it likes, and yet it is these sharp, specific pictures that actually do the sticking. The moment Matsuda opens fire is a perfect example of why it all lands so very hard. For the entire length of the story, Matsuda had been the eager one, the one who trusted Light, the one who kept right on hoping that his friend could not really be the killer they were chasing. When he finally pulls that trigger, all of his hope and trust and heartbreak comes pouring out of him at once. It plays less like a cool action beat and more like years of buried feeling bursting open in a single instant. And it strikes the audience so hard precisely because they watched every bit of that feeling slowly build. The single biggest reason those moments hit so hard is the way the story builds up and then springs its final reversal. For a few long, stretched-out seconds, Light truly believes he has won, and the audience, having followed his every clever move, half believes it right along with him. Then the count runs out and nobody falls, and the floor drops out from under absolutely everything all at once. A good twist surprises a person. A great one makes them rethink everything that came before it in the very same breath. This one is firmly the second kind. The instant those bodies fail to drop, every confident word Light spoke a moment earlier curdles into hard proof of his guilt, and the whole shape of the scene flips itself inside out. Reveals that strong are genuinely rare, and people tend to remember exactly where they were sitting the very first time one landed on them. What makes that reversal feel earned instead of cheap is that the story never once cheated to get there. Everything a person needed in order to see it coming had been quietly laid down in plain view. The patient watcher trailing Mikami, the strict daily routine, the single broken schedule. The story simply trusted that the audience, exactly like Light himself, would be far too dazzled by the bigger game to notice the small, patient moves happening quietly at the edges. When the trap finally snaps closed, a careful viewer feels a real jolt of fairness right alongside the shock, the sense that the whole answer had been sitting there in plain sight the entire time. A mystery that plays completely fair and still manages to surprise is one of the very hardest things to pull off, and pulling it off right at the very end leaves the strongest possible final taste in the mouth. Another reason the ending holds on so tightly is that it flatly refuses to settle anything in a clean way. The story leaves real, genuine room to argue, and people have honestly never stopped arguing about it. Some are completely sure Light got exactly what he deserved. Others quietly feel the world really was a little better while he ruled, and secretly wonder if the wrong side won in the end. Some are convinced Nier outsmarted Light fair and square. Others insist Nier only won by sheer luck, riding entirely on the chaos that Mello kicked up. The story hands over no final scorecard at all, and so the argument has rolled on for years with no sign of ever ending. That wide-open argument turns out to be a strange and powerful kind of fuel. A story that wraps every last thing up in a neat little bow gives a person nothing left to chew on once it is over. This one does the exact opposite. It plants hard questions that have no clean answers, and then simply walks away, leaving everyone behind to fight it out among themselves. Two people can sit and watch the very same ending and come away believing two completely different things about what it actually meant, and both of them can point to real moments to back up their side. That is the kind of ending people keep circling back to, because there is always a little more left to dig at. The deepest reason it sticks, though, is the genuinely uncomfortable thing it does to the person watching it. For most of the long story, the audience is quietly sitting on Light's side. They want him to slip away. They feel the rush when his plans click into place. The ending then makes them sit with the cold fact that they had been cheering for a mass murderer the entire time. That is not a comfortable feeling to carry, and uncomfortable feelings happen to be exactly the ones that refuse to fade. Most stories let the audience stand safely outside the villain, peering in from a comfortable distance. This one drags them all the way inside first, lets them feel everything the villain feels, and only then turns around and shows them the full cost of it. By the time the ending finally arrives, a person cannot fully pull themselves apart from Light, because they spent hours quietly wanting the very same things he wanted. That tiny splinter of recognition, the quiet thought that says, "I was rooting for him," does not rinse out easily at all. It is a real part of why the ending trails after people for so long once it is done. The ending also rewards a second look in a way that very few endings manage to. On a first watch, the trap lands as a pure shock. The forged notebook, the one missing name, the sudden flip of everything. On a second watch, already knowing exactly how it all ends, a person can suddenly see every quiet piece being slid carefully into place far earlier. The patient watcher trailing Mikami, the broken routine, the tiny slip that nobody noticed at the time. The story was playing completely fair the whole way through, hiding its winning move right out in plain sight. Going back and spotting all those threads is its own quiet pleasure, and it keeps drawing people back to the very beginning. Over the years, the ending has earned itself a reputation that only a handful of endings ever reach. It is regularly named among the finest endings any animated story has ever produced. When that final episode first aired, reviewers handed it top marks and praised it openly, without holding much back at all. That kind of high standing does not quietly fade away. It keeps the story sitting near the top of nearly every list of works people are told they simply have to see, which keeps fresh waves of new viewers arriving at that warehouse for the very first time, year after year after year. Far beyond the praise, the story worked its way down deep into the wider world. Light and the death god Ryuk became instantly recognizable figures, known even to a great many people who never once sat down to watch a single episode. Lines and images and moments from the story spread far and wide, repeated and joked about and pointed at in 1,000 different places. The notebook itself quietly turned into a kind of shorthand for the whole dark idea of holding the power of life and death in a person's own two hands. Very few stories ever sink that far into everyday life, and the ones that do tend to be the ones whose endings were strong enough to be truly worth remembering. The clearest sign of that deep grip is how many separate times the whole story has been told over again. It has been turned into live-action films more than once, reshaped for fresh audiences in different countries, and even lifted up onto a stage and sung as a musical. Each brand new version has to wrestle with the same hard ending in its own particular way, some of them staying close to the original, others changing it almost beyond recognition. A story does not get remade that many times unless it left behind a genuinely deep mark, and the mark this one left was carved out in large part by the exact place it chose to end. There is also a quiet strength in just how firmly the story chooses to end. A great many long, wildly popular stories lose their nerve as they near the finish line, dragging things out, softening their own hardest blows, leaving doors cracked open just in case more might be wanted later on. This one does not flinch even a little. The writer had decided where the whole thing would end almost from the very start, and he held tightly to that plan, bringing the entire story to a hard, definite close, rather than letting it sprawl on and on forever. Light dies. The story stops. That kind of plain discipline is its own quiet form of respect for the audience, and it hands the ending a clean, heavy sense of finality that a wandering, drawn-out finish never could have managed to reach. A great deal of the lasting power gathers tightly around Light himself. He is regularly counted among the most unforgettable characters any animated story has ever created, and that is not because anyone finds him likable. It is because he is so completely, so frighteningly believable. He is brilliant and charming and utterly certain of himself, and he is also a cold-blooded monster, and the story never once lets a person fully untangle those two things from each other. A villain who is purely, simply evil is an easy thing to forget. A villain who feels like a real, recognizable person, one who started out genuinely wanting something good, is the kind that stays with a person for good. There is a quiet unease threaded all through the way people remember Light, and it ties right back to the warning sitting inside the ending. Plenty of viewers will openly admit, half joking and half not, that they actually understand him, that they can honestly feel the pull of his idea. That very admission is exactly the thing that makes the ending matter so much. A character who could never tempt a single soul teaches nobody anything at all. Light does tempt people, just a little, and then the ending turns around and shows them precisely where that temptation leads. The discomfort of having felt that pull, even briefly, is a real part of what keeps the whole thing alive in the mind. The way the ending stubbornly refuses to comfort anyone is yet another reason it lasts. It does not pack Light off to some fiery punishment that lets everybody cheer and feel good. It does not grant him a peaceful, well-earned rest either. It simply hands him plain nothing, the very same nothing handed to everyone else, and then it lets a bored death god fly off home as though nothing important had happened at all. That cold, quiet, almost careless final note is a genuinely unusual choice, and unusual choices are the ones that get remembered. It leaves a person unsettled in a way that a neat and tidy ending never possibly could. Underneath every bit of it sits a kind of plain honesty that people can feel even when they cannot quite put a name to it. The ending does not lie to anyone just to make them feel a little better. It does not pretend the whole world magically becomes perfect the moment the villain finally falls. It does not promise that good is always rewarded, or that evil is always punished by some grand power watching from above. It simply shows what happens, plainly and fully and without flinching, and then trusts the audience to be able to handle it. That honesty is a rare thing, and it earns the kind of deep respect that keeps a story alive for decades. Perhaps the surest sign of the ending's long reach is the kind of conversations it keeps starting out in the real world. Long after the screen finally goes dark, people find themselves arguing not only about the story itself, but about the heavy questions sitting underneath it. Whether any single person should ever hold the power to judge and to punish all on their own. Whether good intentions can ever truly excuse terrible acts. Whether a safer world built entirely on fear is actually worth the steep price of building it. The story does not hand anyone clean answers to any of that. It simply passes the questions over, wrapped up inside a gripping tale about a boy and a notebook, and then lets people carry them right out into their own lives. An ending that leaves a person still turning over how the real world works, days and days later, has quietly done something that most stories never come anywhere close to doing. So the staying power comes from many separate threads, all woven tightly together. Moments sharp enough that nobody ever forgets them. A debate that never once closes. A mirror that quietly makes the audience a part of the story. A hidden trap that rewards a careful second look. A towering reputation that keeps drawing in brand new eyes. A villain who is far too human to ever shake off. And a final note too cold and too honest to ever tidy away. Any single one of those threads might slowly fade on its own over time. All of them braided together are the reason that, almost 20 years on, people are still quietly finding their way to that warehouse and still arguing hard about everything they saw there. After all the careful picking apart, all the trap explaining and the theme digging and the weighing of two different endings against each other, the whole story keeps drifting back to one lonely figure standing right in the middle of all of it. A young man who picked up a notebook, decided that he could be a god, and was shown, slowly and patiently and completely, that he never once was. There is one final way left to look at him. One last image the ending quietly leaves behind that somehow holds everything this entire story ever was inside a single, quiet picture. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.